We're almost done getting started. In the next module, I'll give you an Angular refresher, since we'll use Angular in this course. Now, knowing Angular is a prerequisite to this course, but maybe it's been some time since you last worked with it, maybe you only barely touched on it, then this module will help you get back into Angular and its core concepts. Please note that this is of course a totally optional module because, well, it is a prerequisite. If you already know Angular, you can simply fast forward through this module or entirely skip it. Now, once we're done with that refresher, we'll finally dive into Ionic and there into its basics and most importantly in its component basics. Because Ionic mostly is a component framework or library, and therefore components are its core. And in this module, we'll dive into how to use them, how to configure them, and all of that even without Angular. No worries, we'll add Angular back into the app later, but here you'll learn all the basics about Ionic without even needing Angular, which shows a great strength of Ionic. It works with or without a framework, and in this course you'll essentially learn both. Now, once we're done with the component basics, we'll connect Ionic to Angular, and you will learn why you might want to do that, and where the strengths of this combination lie, and how to use both together, how to inject certain Ionic controllers and elements into Angular components, and how Angular components and Ionic components work together. Really exciting stuff. Once we're done with that, it's time to leave the component world a little bit and focus on another core strength of Ionic, what it historically always did. It always allowed you to build native mobile apps with web technologies, so with a framework like Angular. And therefore, in this next module, we'll build native apps with a tool called Capacitor, which is also managed and developed by the Ionic team, which we can use to take our Ionic and Angular web app and convert it into a real native mobile app. And you'll learn how that works and how to run your app on mobile devices in this section, therefore. Thereafter, I'll teach you how to debug your Ionic apps because things not always go as planned, and therefore this is a crucial skill to have. Before we then dive into navigation and routing in Ionic Angular apps. Because switching between different pages is a task you do all the time in web apps and mobile apps. You constantly navigate back and forth. And in this module, you will learn how the Angular router and Ionic work together when it comes to switching between pages. Thereafter, we'll dive deeper into Ionic components, and I'll give you a very thorough overview of all the Ionic components and how to think about them and how to configure them. So this will then really allow you to build any kind of app you want with Ionic's help. Before we then dive into styling and theming. Because obviously you don't just want to use components, you want to make your app look good. And here you'll learn how to do that with the help of Ionic and how to properly assign your own style, your own corporate identity to an Ionic and Angular app, or basically to any Ionic app, you could say. Well, what would an app be without fetching user input, right? And that is indeed what we'll dive into thereafter. You will learn how to work with forms, with Angular forms in Ionic apps, and how to use Ionic components, input components, in these forms, so how that works together. Now, whenever you gathered some data or you have some data in your application, state management becomes an issue. And therefore, I have a whole module dedicated on how you manage state in an Ionic Angular application, before we then also dive into sending HTTP requests so that you're not limited to just managing data locally on your device or in your app, but that you can also store it on servers somewhere in the internet. Now, when you think about typical native apps, and that is still one of the core focuses of Ionic, building native apps. So if you think of such native apps, what often comes to mind is using maps or the camera in there. Well, I will cover both in this course, and I will start by adding Google Maps in a specific section where I will show you how to add that, how to unlock the API, and how to use Google Maps from scratch in an Ionic app. Before we then dive into native device features in general, like using the camera or fetching the current user location. Now, that is all nice, but what would a real app be without some user authentication? And therefore, I got a whole module dedicated to showing you how to add authentication to your application. And once we did all that, we'll have quite a nice app. And that is another important thing throughout this course. We built a project, a realistic project, and I will demo most of these things on that project. There are some side projects or smaller demos as well, but I believe you'll learn the most if you work on a concrete example, on a concrete project. And therefore, this is what we'll do in this course as well. And once we finish that project, which we'll have after the authentication section, it is of course time to publish the app. And therefore, in the publishing section, I will teach you how you can get your application into the Google Play Store, into the Apple App Store, or also publish it as a web app, because that is something you can build with Ionic and Angular too. You can ship a regular web app or even a progressive web app, which I will show to you as well. And that's it. We're then done, and I will conclude the course, give you some next steps, but by that point, by that time, you will have learned all you need to build amazing Ionic apps and build up on the foundation you get in this course with the official docs, with other resources, and of course by simply building a ton of stuff, and that will enable you to build any kind of app you want with Ionic and Angular. So let's dive in.